My co-author is David Olusoga. He's a, how would I explain that? He's born in Newcastle, England, but is of Nigerian descent. So Africa is very close to his heart, and he's a historian like myself, and I think some point in his readings he came across a reference to Namibia, and he started reading up on it, and he managed to get a bit of money to come to Namibia and to do a bit of research to see whether it was possible to do a documentary about it. And it just so happened at that time I was busy writing my master's on very specific parts of the genocide. Thank you very much. We were introduced and immediately hit it off and found that we were on the same wavelength. Eventually he managed to secure enough funds for the film, and had read my master's thesis by then. And then we set off into the Namibian landscape, armed with cameras and a lot of good intentions and a lot of research, a lot of heavy research behind us, and that resulted in the BBC documentary that you may know of, called Genocide in the Second Reich. On the basis of that documentary, David managed to get us a book deal. And so we spent the next four years collaborating on this project.
How was the process, and was it difficult to collaborate on something so with such a large volume and such a complex topic?
Let me say that emails are a good form of communication and a bad form of communication. The good part is that I couldn't reach out and kill him through the emails because I wanted too many times, and I'm sure the same with him. So it's a very difficult process. I mean, when you're not sitting in the same space together and you can't talk things through, and people go off on a tangent. I went off on one tangent and he went off on another. And then later you compare notes and you say, "What, are you mad?" We say that to each other. So I think in reality we wrote 2 books, and with the help of an editor we managed to cut it down to size.
Okay.
But it was a very tough process, also because the subject matter is quite difficult, and I certainly had a lot of emotions attached to it for a long period, a lot of anger, because a lot of this wasn't known, especially around the concentration camps. I mean, the previous head of the Namibian National Archives, Brigitte Lau, famously said in one of her little papers that as far as she knew, there were no records. The archives were completely silent as with reference to the concentration camps. And so she doubted that they were actually there, or whether you could call them concentration camps, and maybe they were just a form of internment camps and so on. So I went on a very long, I think, spent 2 years just digging through various materials at the archives and piecing together this large mosaic of information from all kinds of different places. I mean, there wasn't one file that's called concentration camps and Namibian genocide. The Germans weren't that organized. So the stuff was really scattered all over, and I had to learn how to read this difficult German handwriting. So I was very, involved and engaged with the subject matter, and sometimes I was too close to it, and David had to pull me back a bit and say, well, let's look at the bigger picture as well. So it was difficult, but we also complemented each other really well, because I had a tendency towards the microcosm, and he had a tendency to say, let's pull out and let's look at the bigger international trends at the time, and what were the theories that were being discussed at the time, race and so on. So I think we really complemented each other very, very well. David also has a lot of experience being a journalist. I'm not a journalist. I'm a historian, and so he helped also with the process of telling a story. Certain journalistic skills come with that.
Kaiser's Holocaust.
Yes.
The word Holocaust, of course, must be a deliberate choice. Given the contention, of that narrative that suggests that what happened under the Nazis was the singular Holocaust in human history. Can you tell us a little bit about the choice to make that the title?
Well, we obviously knew that it was contentious, and I think the publishers liked it for that reason as well. But our whole point with writing this book was to try to look at the history of the colonial history in a different way, not just looking at what did it mean to Africa, the underdevelopment that we're seeing in Africa, that's underdevelopment as an active thing that has happened over many, many years, but also what did it mean for Europe, and trying to look at what were the imports that came out of colonialism that went to Europe, what were the ideas and the thoughts. And it's interesting, for example, that the word genocide only appeared in 1944, I think Raphael Lemkin came up with the term, coined the term, and so we didn't have a word that described the sort of level of mass killing and mass destruction before that. And what we were debating was that because this level of violence and industrial scale killing had not taken place in Europe before, so they were not as familiar with it, because of course we'd seen it in the colonial time again and again. I mean, from Latin America to Africa to Australia, in preceding centuries. So why was it that it was only in 1944 that we came up with the term genocide, whereas these things had been taking place again and again in the colonial world? And so we were attempting the argument, or looking at the argument, that was it partially because ideas and things that were all right and were allowed in the colonies, some of these people came back with ideas and concepts and thoughts, and they little by little started implementing them. What happened in Namibia was perhaps not on the same scale. If you look at actual figures, and maybe there wasn't the same overall intent, but you do see the roots of what happened in Europe, and so people can easily recognize the term Holocaust and relate it to something. So we're not trying to belittle the Holocaust or what happened in the Holocaust, or use it in any way and say this was. But it's very easy for people to connect with that, and we're talking, of course, of the bigger picture of colonialism.
Say Germany's forgotten genocide and the colonial roots of Nazism.
Yes.
And reading the book, it not only forgotten, but perhaps intended to be that way. Can you enlighten us a little bit about that?
Books have been written, papers have been written about it, but usually related to kind of a very small niche within academia, and one that's not very many people are familiar with. We do make reference to the works of Drexler and other people who started exploring this in the 60s. But as you say, up until the 60s, it was more or less forgotten. Not many people knew about it until Drexler, East German historian who had access to the files in Potsdam, brought this to light. Even now, I mean, certainly in the popular discourse, not many people are aware of this. There might be a few historians here, there are a few academics who know about it, but in the bigger picture, not many people are aware. And we brought a lot of new material out in this book. A lot of it related to the work that I had done on the concentration camps, which was all fairly new. As you said, one of the things that emerged when we started doing the research, or I was doing the research, is there are a set of files in the National Archives that are sort of secret files, where secret correspondence between the local government and the central government is held. And really, when I started deciphering that, it became clear that, first of all, there was a level of knowledge amongst the bureaucrats and the colonial administrators about what was going on, right from the outset, that could not be denied. And yet, even in the media and so on, this was never made public. And very few people knew about it, and it was always cast as propaganda. But then, when you look at the geopolitics and the international politics following the First World War, where in Namibia diamonds had been discovered, and there were a lot of money to be found in this place, and so there was a lot of interest from the Cape and the British to get their hands on these natural resources that were here and raw materials that were here. For that reason, the whole thing of what happened, a blue book was written, and a very quite an amazing report was written by South African of Irish descent called O'Reilly about the atrocities, and that was used at Versailles as, you know, showing how Germany shouldn't have colonies, and they used it to try to claim it and say they can't be allowed to have colonies and give us the mandate instead. But after that, so that was the first time where it was really international news, and everybody knew about it, and it was out in the open. But after that, I think the South Africans quickly realized that, you know, there were not very many white people in this territory, and to control it, you couldn't afford to fight a war on many fronts. So you had to appease the German community and find some sort of amenable solution. And so, as a way of appeasing the local community, the Blue Book was kind of ceremonially destroyed or theatrically destroyed and burnt, and said it was all lies and let's move on. And from then on, it was actively, you know, forgotten.
Right.
So there was a long period where this was not really spoken about or known about, and you only find a few references here or there. So it was, you know, repressed is probably a better word. I think there's an active act of letting go and pretending that it didn't happen. It didn't fit with the narrative of, you know, the colonial narrative, the paternalistic narrative of creating something new in Africa, little Europe, and building it up and developing it, and those four narratives. So
it was also repressed somehow by the Allied powers after World War II.
If you look at the whole, again, we're coming back to Lemkin and his initial definition of genocide, what genocide is, you could not tell the difference between what was going on in the colonial worlds at the time and his definition of genocide. He talked about the impression of a system on top of the existing, and destruction of the national model, and impression of a new system on top of that, which was colonialism. And that wider definition was rejected by the Allied powers, obviously, because they all had colonies in some form or other, had empires to protect. So it was narrowed down to this ethnocide of killing a large number of people and doing so with intent, which is the narrow definition that we still talk about now. But Lemkin's was actually a lot wider. Yeah. And so there were, again, a lot of geopolitical interests at play, and people weren't so keen on really addressing the colonial issue, because it was still going on, and people were still making a lot of money from it across the world.
Yeah. You talk a little bit about the camps that were run here with a lot of new research. There were actually privately run camps here. Was that a sort of a first, or was that something that was happening in other places?
Well, the whole concept of the concentration camp, of course, you can argue that these sort of things have existed for a long time, but the whole concept dates back to to Cuba, the Spanish War in Cuba, in, was it 1894, I think, thereabouts, where the Spanish then incarcerated a lot of people in these camps, including civilians. And there was a great international outcry, including the British, then against it. Then, of course, with the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa, they were reintroduced and used by Lord Kitchener as a way of controlling the population and almost using the civilian population as hostages. Using the civilian population as hostages in a form of blackmail of the guerrilla soldiers, of the Boer soldiers. That's the time where the word concentration camp was invented in the British Parliament. Right. A lot of Germans fought alongside the Boers in that war. There was a lot of sympathy, outpouring of sympathy for the Boers' plight against the Great British Empire, and a lot of people joined, and there were military attaches, and a lot of the people who were in the army here were in South Africa at the time, and they saw what was going on. Now, I can't say that they learned what happened there, but they certainly knew of the concept. And then that concept was then brought to Namibia in 1945, the change of the year, and the whole labor aspect. I mean, of course, there were African camps also in South Africa that are not very well known, and I'm sure there was labor carried out. I mean, but there's very specific labor aspect that came here, where you could actually rent out prisoners to private companies, and money would go to the state, and they were kept in camps. It was the result of a paper written by a nobleman, von Stilfrieden Ratzowitz, whose house was incidentally just up behind us here on the hill. That was a whole new concept, and you could argue that is the kind of the birth of the labor camp. Although, again, during the Second World War, it took on a whole different dimension. But I believe that there's an argument to be made that this was one of the first examples of labor camps.
Right.
And that was the primary purpose of these camps when they were started. That people would be used, because with so many people gone from central Namibia, there was no more any labor to be had.
Right.
The labor force was gone, and cheap labor was gone.
Right.
People were hiding or dead or whatever.
Right.
And the other side of that was that there was a war economy, so lots of money was being artificially pumped into the colony, so there was a real need for labor.
Right.
So that was the main point of getting these camps going.
These stories are often told just from the colonizing powers kind of point of view, but you and David obviously worked very hard to incorporate some counter narratives.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Maybe Hendrik Witbooi is quite a fascinating character.
We didn't just want to have the voice of the colonizer being overpowering in the narrative. We want to hear from the perspective of the colonized as well. And we're extremely lucky in Namibia in that we actually do have records from the time. We have the diaries of Hendrik Witbooi, for example, their letters that are preserved, and the population in Namibia at the time. Many were quite well educated, relatively speaking, and could read and write, and spoke a host of languages. So we do have access to their voices, and of course that's something that's perhaps missing in many other countries. You mentioned Hochschild's book as well. We don't hear that voice coming out so strongly, simply because the documents are not really there.
Right.
And where they are there, it's kind of written by somebody else on behalf of, so we get all these people coming out from the abolitionist movement and so on.
Right, a lot of filters.
A lot of filters, exactly.
Yeah.
But here is unfiltered. This is the voice of the people, and it's Hendrik Witbooi is very eloquent and was perfectly able to string thoughts together and arguments, and so he was quite an amazing character. So we were fortunate in that sense to have that.
At some stage in the history, there were a group of Nama and Herero leaders and representatives who went to Germany.
Yes.
And just by their presence and their dignity and the way they carried themselves, they challenged the notions of white supremacy that a lot of people held at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The whole exhibition in Treptow Park, I think it was in 1894 in Berlin, was supposed to be Germany displaying its might and its the exotic nature of the empire, and bringing all these strange people, and people could come and gaze at them almost like in a zoo, and say this is what our empire is now, an affirmation of how big we've become.
Right.
And it didn't at all fit with that story. When the Namibian delegation walked off, some of them in classic three-piece suits and and bandoliers and guns and very self-assured, and I think it was a constant thorn in the side of many of the arrangers of this exhibition, that these guys didn't just do what they were told.
Right.
They were who they were, and that was that. The irony was that after one of them was Frederick Marrero, the son of Samuel Marrero, and he was quite a tall, handsome fella. And many of the women there who came to view this exotic colonial show actually ended up falling for the guy, and he was receiving fan mail and love letters from Berlin years later. But I don't think any of them ever got to him. It's very likely that they got intercepted by the missionaries and destroyed. But,
sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure the missionaries wouldn't have let that through.
No.
Speaking of missionaries, can you talk a little bit about how kind of the missionaries kind of accompanied the traders and the soldiers, and what kind of role that they played in this whole project?
You know, when we wrote this, the image of the period of where the American invasion of Iraq was very close, and I couldn't help when I was reading these documents of comparing the kind of hype, the patriotic hype in the media, and just how frenetic and crazy that whole episode was. If you think back to 2003, 2004, the international media just completely went berserk and bought this patriotic invasion of Iraq wholesale and didn't ask any questions. And I think that's the sort of environment that the missionaries operated in.
Right.
I mean, they knew the local population better than anybody. They'd been there for ages with missions and built up relationships, and in many ways, were dependent on these communities.
Right.
But after the outbreak of war, they now were being forced by the settler community to choose: are you with them? Are you with us? There was no grey areas. So they were in a way, some more willingly than others, forced to become an agent of the German army and the German administration here. There's a lot of talk about Lothar von Trotha, the general who issued the infamous extermination order. But a lot of the killing was actually done later by his successor, the civilian governor, Friedrich von Lindequist. And what Lindequist did, the moment he stepped off the boat, he called a meeting with the local missionaries and said, guys, go out, send out the news that the peace has come. The general has left, and now it's peace. So go out and give messages to all the people, and send people into the bush and say it's safe to come out now, and I'm here, and it's all over. Now, to the extent that the missionaries knew about the deceit, because this was a deceit, this was a big trap being laid by the German administration. What would eventually happen was that when people came out and being promised food and so on, they were first ushered into collection points where they were given food and allowed to get, as one guy, etwas herausgefuttert, to be a little bit fattened up before they were then sent off to the public works and concentration camps and so on, where many of them would anyway die. Right. So it was a big lie. And to the extent that the missionaries knew about this, it's difficult to say from the outset. Of course, when the first guys started marching off to the concentration camp, started dying, then they knew about it. Yeah. And this thing then carried on for quite a while afterwards. So in a sense, the missionaries became complicit in the death of thousands of Namibians.
The early attempts at colonization, including the father of well-known Nazi Hermann Göring, mostly were trying to consist of leaders trying to make treaties, ceding their rights, ceding their lands, What difficulties did he encounter that, for example, Leopold would not have encountered, say,
without making any assumptions about the Congo? Germany was a colonial novice in many ways. I mean, they came late to the table. They were only given colonies at the Berlin Conference, and sort of colonies that had been laid claim to by some of the German traders who were on the coast, but also colonies and territories that not many people really wanted. And that here I'm talking mainly about Namibia. Namibia was not very attractive at the time. I think East Africa is a whole different ballgame. But so they were very much colonial novices, Germany, and they didn't really know how to handle a big colonial empire. So I think a lot of the models that were used to try to take over these colonies were based on what the English had done, and what the French had done, and so on, what other nations had done in Africa. But I think it was also based on some level of naivety. They didn't really know what they were getting into, and what many of these people knew about the world outside were from romantic novels and explorers and so on. So Heinrich Ernst Göring was first sent here by Bismarck to try to make treaties with the major communities to kind of annex it in a sense to Germany. And he really struggled. I mean, whatever he believed was the case was not the case. There was one incident where, when he first arrived, he and his fellow travelers, Goldsmith and I forget the other guy's name, they kind of dressed up in their finest uniforms to look posh and to impress the natives. But of course, the natives, or the hereros, didn't actually give a damn. They knew perfectly well who these guys were, where they're coming from, and because the missionaries had been there, traders had been there. They were worldly people who knew what was going on. So, and they had their own political issues that they were dealing with, and these guys were outsiders, and so they granted them an audience and listened to them, and then saying thank you very much, and dealt with their own things. So I think when Göring set off, he could not have imagined how irrelevant he was. He didn't have any positions of power. It was all bluster, and very quickly that was. He started off writing these treaties, say we will protect you, but as soon as the first attacks happened from the Namas, it was clear he couldn't do anything. Right. So he was irrelevant from day one, and he managed to secure some agreements, and ultimately was kicked out by the hereros who said you're useless. Right. And he partly also because he desecrated some herero graves in Ochimbingwe. Probably unwittingly, but nonetheless, and he got kicked out. And so I think they were. Whereas he also didn't come in with a big army, because Bismarck wasn't a big believer in having colonies to begin with. Right. So he didn't want to invest a lot of money in it. Right. Whereas Leopold, that was his fiefdom. Right. He could put as much military force behind it as he wanted to. Right. That was his decision. Right. Which of course Kaiser Wilhelm II eventually did in Namibia, because they didn't have any power really up until the mid 1890s, and then not much. So it was only after the genocides that they really managed to conquer the place as such.
You kind of explore to a degree, the discussions and themes that were happening in Germany at the time, and the confluence of several of those, the pseudoscience, the racially based kind of what nobody today would refer to as science, and the need for living space. Those kind of themes kind of came together to really put a lot of pressure. Yeah. Is that as much of a factor as the economic considerations, do you think, or?
Well, there was a shift that happened from the pragmatic Bismarck in the 80s. We all know the term Realpolitik, which is very pragmatic politics that he believed in. If we can't afford it, then let's not do it unless we get something out of it. And so he kind of used it in a bigger international game, more for getting something in Germany. But when the old Wilhelm I died, and then shortly afterwards the Frederick, his successor, also died, the German throne of the United Germany was handed over to a very young Wilhelm II, who was a difficult personality to begin with, and he didn't subscribe to Bismarck's Realpolitik. He was very much for the colonies, and mainly for issues of prestige, international prestige. To say we are one of the big international forces to be reckoned with, and therefore we need to have colonies, cost what it will. And so he was more about the glamour of it,
and intimidated by the British also to some degree.
Very much, of course, and it's justifiably so. So that was one of the big differences in the school of thought between the two, and he introduced this Weltpolitik in the 90s, in the late 1890s, which was really about positioning Germany in the world and world politics. So in fact he had secret plans drawn up for an invasion of New York at some point around 1900, but that he was dissuaded from in the last minute. Did I answer your question? What was? Can't remember. I was carried away there.
Actually, I'd like to just go back a little bit to the science and the kind of language and discourse.
Well, I think there was a confluence in this era of Weltpolitik. There was a confluence of ideas that kind of fed into that. One of them was the idea of Lebensraum, which was a social Darwinian notion, but looking not at societies but at nations, saying that nations need
nation as an organism,
that needs to grow and need to gain territory and so on. We of course know of Lebensraum from Hitler and the Third Reich. That was one of the central tenets. But this was actually a colonial notion. And one of Friedrich Ratzel's favorite colonial spaces was Namibia.
Right.
And I mean, you asked about the economic consideration. Mm-hmm. There was the economic consideration in the colonial world, where you tried to get natural raw materials and so on, extract those, and those were used for the German industry to generate whatever and sell it back and make money, the way the English were doing in India and many other places. So that was kind of Bismarck's hope, but places like Namibia didn't have anything. They hadn't found diamonds, and it was just sand speck. There was nothing here. And then there was the other kind of colonial model, which was all again about prestige. Right. That was the settler model, where you go in and you impose your model, as Lemkin would later explain it, where you destroy the existing model and you bring in your own model. This is what had happened in Argentina, where the population was killed off. This is what was happening, or just the end of it was coming to an end in the U.S. with the Native Americans. This is what had been happening in Australia as well, where the native population was being hunted down and killed off, and then the settler population moved in and took over and created a new England, a new whatever. And that was what was actively being pursued then in this time of Weltpolitik,
right,
of Wilhelm II in Namibia, right, the prestige colony. It was about creating a little Germany, and that's what they actively wanted to do, and it cost a lot of money. It was a prestige project, and Weltpolitik was certainly in that sense inspired by these bigger notions of saying we are, it's Europeans, and particularly Northern Europeans and Germans, are better people, and therefore we deserve this. These people who've never used these territories, and who've never, I think the example of this mad focus on the agrarianism, who've never plowed the soil and never, done any form of agriculture, they don't deserve to have it.
Right.
They're hunter-gatherers. They're
right,
obsolete. Their time came and went. This is our time as white people, and it's ours. We're entitled to it.
Right.
So there was a confluence of ideas, and geopolitically, it sort of all came together at that point in Germany, and so. This is where we're saying that, the roots of Nazism, in fact, lie with that confluence of ideas, and Namibia was one of the places where they tried to do it.
Right.
Then it evolved from there.
Right. This genocide cannot be reduced to the act of one fanatical general. Often, I grew up in the West. Yeah. When the kind of narrative there is, that Nazism was a singular evil, and very often reduced to one man who we know as Hitler, of course. Yeah. And the same kind of pressures and themes seem to be at work in trying to explain this genocide, the effort to reduce it to one person.
Again, before we wrote the book, this was part of the conversations that we had on the long roads driving in Namibia in a rented bakkie, where we reflected on after Nuremberg. What happened after the execution of the people who were convicted at Nuremberg? They were first executed, then they were cremated, and then their ashes were dispersed in undisclosed locations. And why would you go to that extent? Why not a grave, or almost like Bin Laden now has been dumped somewhere in the ocean. We don't know where, but it's like we're destroying some kind of evil. We're exercising some sort of evil and an apparition, saying these are not human beings, they're monsters, and so we're destroying them. And we don't reflect on the fact that no, they're not. They're human beings like us, and the monster is in here. It's in all of us. We all have the potential of doing this, every single one of us. And that's what the reality we don't want to connect with. So we build up these kind of, again, I can only use the word monster, these freaks who do terrible things that the rest of us would never dream of doing because we're good Christians or whatever we are. But it's not the fact.
Right.
They were normal human beings. And if you, of course, look at the Third Reich, and here, I mean, what happened was not the work of one man. There's a lot of people, and a lot of people accepted it because they carried favor. They got something out of it. A lot of people get something tangible out of it. So it's you see. So it's a very, very interesting thing about history. It's that we choose to remember what suits us, and we pick out the bits and pieces that suit us, but we don't want to reflect on the dark side of the medal, so to speak. And if you look at Namibia, I mean, when I first started writing about these things, going on the air, writing newspaper articles in your own newspaper, the Namibian, about it, I got a lot of feedback that wasn't very nice from the German community here. And it's understandable because it's tied to their identity, and they're grown up with the illusion that no, it was all benevolent and we did all these good things and we're the reason that Namibia works now, and so on. So you don't want to hear that your grandfather was a mass murderer or was a guard in a camp and, at least partially or responsible for the death of a lot of people, or at least he took part in something bigger. So we when it comes to our identity and who we are, we choose not to engage with that. So this is kind of the darker side of it, and saying, these things actually happened. And you mentioned earlier getting the voice of the colonized. I did research, I think a couple of years back, incidentally sponsored by the German embassy, where they allowed me to go around and interview people who were in the 80s and 90s around Namibia. I did about 70 interviews.
Right.
Really with the specific aim of saying, well, what's in oral tradition, what's in oral history, what's in personal memories, recollections from that time? Because if you're 90 now, your parents or grandparents were in some way involved, and I know what my grandparents and my parents were involved in, so the likelihood is that a 70 or 80-year-old or a 90-year-old person will also know. And of course this was true, and for the first time ever we got a catalogue of stories coming out of what actually happened to people. And the hurt that's still sitting there with people. I remember one lady from the Okakarara area up by the Waterberg who was saying that she was in her 90s or late 80s, I think. And she's saying, no, my father's brothers were on Shark Island and they all died there. And we only heard from somebody who came back later. And all my life I wanted to go to Shark Island to see this place that I heard all these stories about. But now I'm too old and it will never happen. So, I mean, there's real recollection of what happened, and somebody who's always wanted to go and see where did people do these things to my family members. So it's still alive, it's still living, it's there, and we need to somehow engage with it, and that's part of what we try to do here.
Right. What is the situation like today for many of the descendants?
Well, Namibia has only been independent for 21 years. It was essentially a colony up until 1990, still under South African rule, apartheid. It was one of apartheid South Africa's little laboratories where they could try things out, and all the things that people know about apartheid South Africa took place here as well in Namibia. So it was a very violent century in Namibia. From 1904 to about 1990, it was really under the colonial yoke in a big way.
Yeah.
And many people, of course, haven't recovered. This is several generations worth of suppression and underdevelopment. So a lot of people are living in abject poverty. As soon as you move outside of Windhoek, where you can see it's quite nice and it's quite developed and so on. So usually you move into the old reserves. You see people living on nothing.
Right. It's